Episode 76, June 28, 1915. Men into Beasts, The Horrors of Anzac. By Digger Craven. Read by Tim Pearce. Digger Craven was in the Australian Infantry during the weary months at Gallipoli. After the war, he told his story to W.J. Blackledge, who transcribes it here. It has all the urgency of deeply recollected horror and provides a wonderful picture of the carnage and beastliness of the Mediterranean campaign. Suddenly, we were dragged from our diggings and thrust into the front line for an attack. This was the historic ill-starred demonstration of the 28th of June. We in the trenches did not know then that this so-called attack was to be merely a demonstration to keep the enemy on our front, while the 29th Division at Cape Helles made one more shot at capturing Achibaba. It failed, but the Tommies on that front gained 1,000 yards, and that was some victory for the peninsula. We attacked, once out of the cover of our trenches and sap heads, and hell was let loose. Remember, we made this attack after weeks of strain and drudgery, incessant trench warfare, listening post duties, sentry duties, with every faculty on edge, existing with the perpetual head-bursting crack of snipers' bullets, the everlasting zoom and crash of shells, tearing the nerves. We went into the attack crazed and stupefied, with the heat, the stench, the fumes and dirt of belching shells. We were mad, stark raving mad, out for blood, anybody's blood, anything to break the strain of that frightful tension. It was a sort of thing that cannot be described. We met withering fire from the strongly entrenched Turks. We met newly wired positions. Men were trapped in the entangling barbs and shot to pieces while they struggled to free themselves. We leapt into a narrow gully, and into it, from underground trenches, poured a massed horde of Turks, for all the world as if it vomited out of the bowels of the earth by some volcanic eruption. Thereafter an inferno of slaughtering underground with cold steel, an exhibition of savagery by tormented bodies, clusters and little groups at each other's throats, in a confined area which so cramped our actions that we fought at the crouch, jabbing and sticking, yelling and cursing, choking the cries of Allah, Allah, with the bayonet thrusts, trampling dead and wounded, while we went forward to meet more and more figures coming out of the earth, till the ground seemed literally to be spawning Turks. It was a swift, incredibly ferocious attack that availed us nothing, that is, so far as we who participated in it could see, for we were commanded to retire, to fall back on our own lines. It was not to be an attack, but a demonstration. We got back into our own lines and cursed our commanders for sending us out there merely to bring us back again. We were told it was to help our mates down in the south, that victory down there by the 29th Division cost us in the north a few hundred more casualties. We might have been excused for wondering what the hell it was all about. I am convinced that war-worn and weary Anzacs were never quite the same after those demonstrations. As everyone now knows, Anzac was the key position for the whole peninsula, for it faced the narrow waist leading to the narrows of the Dardanelles. The 29th Division, together with the Naval Division and the French armies, beat themselves to death attacking 6 different and almost impregnable positions on the toe of the peninsula. Thousands of men were thrown away in order to hold an utterly useless position. Instead of demonstrating at Anzac, we should have concentrated our main attack there and used the worthless Cape Helles position for feints and demonstrations. Once astride the peninsula from Anzac to the Narrows, all the Turks in the south, right down to the toe, would have been trapped, cut off from their base and source of supplies. Instead of which we frittered away our forces on no fewer than 9 different fronts, from Suvla Point in the north to S Beach in the south. That victory of 1,000 yards could not be followed up, because those responsible were starving the Gallipoli campaign of both men and munitions. It began as a muddle, and it went on in the same fashion. More than a month was to pass before that victory could be followed up. During that time, Johnny built himself new and stronger trenches, and generally fortified his position. He did more. He rebuilt his army. The beaten and war-weary troops were withdrawn, and reinforcements from the very pick and flower of the Turkish Empire took over the task of keeping the Allies hanging perilously to the edge of the cliffs round the coast. With that demonstration at Anzac, we started up trouble. At midnight of June 29th to 30th, Johnny made his counterattack. Enver Pasha sent an army of 30,000 strong to drive the foreigners into the sea or never look upon his face again. The foreigners being us, the Anzacs, the savages from the South Sea, as we learnt from some of our prisoners. They began the attack with a terrific artillery bombardment. The night was hideous with screaming of shells and the bellowing explosions. It seemed as if the whole of the Turkish artillery was concentrated on our lines. Never before had they pounded us with such a blasting volume of shot and shell. Some of our underground works were stove in. Parapets were blown away in dense clouds of dust and flying debris. The fumes from the shells were so thick that men could not see, could not use their eyes, for they smarted and watered as if in a gas attack. But this was no gas attack. Johnny was throwing all he had at us. We knew what that meant. He was going to attack. We were standing to on the fire step waiting. It can be an agony, that waiting, while the shells shriek and roar and crash all around. It can be hell. It was a date one long to be remembered. It was a hellish date, as bad as anything that ever happened in my little orbit of the campaign. Then they came, with Allah on their tongues and fiendish lust in their black eyes, dense masses of them racing towards us over no man's land, shoulder to shoulder. We bombed them, shelled them, shattered them with rifle fire, shot great gaps into their massed ranks. They broke, wavered, went down in thousands. Others came up and took their places, tumbling and staggering over the dead and wounded, yelling of their faith, screaming every sort of dirty imprecation at the Christian dogs whom they would now drive into the sea. And all we had to do was to stand firm and pot at them, knock them over like grotesque dummies in an Aunt Sally stall. There never was such slaughter on any front. Never was so many killed and wounded in the short space of one night. It seemed to us in those dark hours before the dawn that we could not kill fast enough, for swiftly as we shot them down, there were always others to take the gaps. They came on, drew near our lines. They were most definitely advancing. It appeared at one time that nothing could hold back the massed yelling hordes. Hundreds were brought to their knees within a few yards of our parapet. Bombs were thrown back and forth. Our tunnelling had not been in vain. We had at that time a number of T-saps shooting out from under our front line trenches into no man's land. Each of these was built by mining underground, straight out for several yards, then opening up with a crosshead, like the head of the letter T. The enemy stumbled into these camouflaged sap heads as they neared our lines and were terribly butchered before they had time to get over their surprise. That underground fighting at Anzac was a little war of its own. It was a war in which the unwary Turk never had a chance to hit back. He fell in heaps, was clubbed or struck before he could rise to his knees. In some parts of the Anzac front, there was a perfect network of tunnels, an entirely new sort of firing line, prepared underground and complete with barbed wire entanglements. Bunches of the enemy were trapped in these, their unwary entry being the signal for a shower of bombs that blew them sky high. By dawn it was all over. Johnny retired. His wonderful army of 30,000 strong was utterly defeated, with a loss of a quarter of its strength, between 7,000 and 8,000 killed and wounded. For many days afterwards we could hear the screams of the wounded slowly dying out there of thirst and torturing wounds. Wherever there was movement, a merciful shot went home. Another son of Allah went to his maker. It was there that Turkey's famous 18th Regiment was wiped out, and Mustafa Kemal, who was later to become dictator of Turkey, was disgraced by Enver Pasha. From then onwards, Gallipoli was an open graveyard. It stank. No man can recall that campaign without sickening again at the stench. Dead lay around the trenches and between the lines, friend and foe rotting in the sun. The incessant tunnelling of both sides had drawn us closer together. In some parts we were less than 80 yards from each other. That meant a never-ending watch, never to relax for a second. Sentry duty at these points was a ghastly nerve strain, a perpetual agony with every faculty in edge, so that men had to be relieved at very short intervals. And as the summer advanced, the conditions grew worse and worse. Dysentery took a very heavy toll. Water was scarce and strictly rationed. There were increasing cases of jaundice. There were septic sores, unclean ulcers, rat bites that nothing seemed to heal, and lice beyond all human control. The trenches were always full of black flies. We cursed the sun and the flies and the lice as enemies more terrible than the Turks. Despite all our energetic efforts at keeping our habitations in the ground clean, we could do nothing against those rotting bodies out there, could do nothing to combat the insanitary conditions under which the Turks and their Arab irregulars lived.
His loot and it fits upon his shoulder, the right hand